The cold, bustling streets of New York were filled with people rushing to their destinations. Some hurried to work, others were lost in their phones, disconnected from the world around them. But no one stopped to notice the man sitting in the corner. In front of him lay a torn piece of cardboard with shaky letters scrawled across it. "I am ashamed of what I've done. Forgive me." His knees trembled, whether from the cold or the weight of regret, no one could tell. He wrapped himself tightly in an old, tattered coat, trying to shield himself from the emptiness within. People passed by without a second glance, avoiding his gaze, unwilling to acknowledge the presence of a man who had fallen so far. Like every other day, he sat there, hoping for a few coins, a moment of kindness, something, anything, but no one stopped. The scars on his face told stories of a past filled with crime, prison sentences, and the family he had lost along the way. Society had already decided his fate. A man like him didn't deserve another chance. But that day, something changed. Through the crowd, a man slowly made his way toward him, a familiar face, marked by wisdom and time, a deep, resonant voice that millions knew. Morgan Freeman. The man lifted his head, immediately recognizing him. Morgan's eyes scanned the cardboard sign, taking in the words carefully. Then, without hesitation, he knelt down, looked straight into the man's eyes, and spoke. "Tell me your story." The man saw no judgment in Morgan Freeman's eyes, only a quiet, patient interest. It was a look he hadn't received in years, one that carried a warmth he had long forgotten. He took a shaky breath. It had been so long since he had spoken about his past, but something inside told him this was a moment he couldn't let slip away. I was a terrible man 15 years ago," he began, his voice hoarse and unsteady. "Robbery, assault, fraud, that was my life. Gangs were my family. Crime was my home." Morgan remained silent, listening without interruption. He knew that sometimes silence was the only way to make a man truly speak. But as the man continued, his voice trembled, his hands clenched together as if holding on to something invisible. He took a deep breath, his gaze shifting downward. "But my wife, my 2 sons," he hesitated, swallowing hard. "They left me, and they were right to." Morgan lowered his head slightly, acknowledging the weight of those words. "And then?" he asked, his voice gentle but firm. The man cleared his throat and looked away, as if ashamed. "I went to prison, 9 years. I burned with regret every single day. But when I got out, things were worse." He ran his fingers along the frayed edges of the cardboard sign in front of him, his face darkening with shadowed memories. "Prison. People think it's just a punishment, but they don't realize the real sentence starts when you get out." Morgan glanced at the man's hands. They were rough, marked with years of struggle, carrying the silent weight of a story too painful to tell all at once. The man inhaled deeply before continuing. "I thought they would forgive me, my family, my sons, but when I came home, the door was shut in my face. My wife had married someone else. My kids thought their father was dead." He paused. His eyes seemed lost in a distant place. "My son opened the door. He looked at me, but he didn't recognize me." A long silence. He just stood there, confused. And then he called out, "Mom, someone's at the door." Morgan felt a knot tighten in his chest. "That was the moment I died," the man whispered, his voice cracking. "I walked out of that prison, but there was no place left for me in the world." Morgan exhaled slowly. "They wouldn't let me in. My own mother refused to see me. My brothers hung up the phone. Every job I applied to turned me away the second they saw my record. No one trusted me. No one even looked at me as a person anymore." Tears welled in the man's eyes. And now, his gaze dropped to the cardboard sign in front of him. "I live on the streets. I left one prison just to enter another." Morgan studied him for a long moment. He could see the genuine regret, the exhaustion, the truth in his words. Slowly, the man lifted his head and looked directly into Morgan's eyes. "You know, Freeman," he whispered, his voice barely audible, "people say there's no such thing as a second chance. But I know that's a lie. There is. It's just that no one wants to give it." Morgan let out a deep sigh. He thought for a moment, then reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. "This isn't over." The man blinked in disbelief. "I'm going to do something for you." For the first time in years, the man didn't hide his tears. Because for the first time in years, someone was offering him hope. Morgan Freeman took out his phone and dialed a few numbers. "I'm getting you a place to stay. You won't spend another night on the streets." The man shook his head, overwhelmed. I don't deserve this." Morgan met his gaze, steady and unyielding. "Who doesn't deserve a second chance?" The man fell silent. He had no answer. That night, Morgan arranged for him to stay at a shelter. For the first time in years, he slept under a roof. But this was just the beginning. The next day, Freeman secured him a job interview. The man's hands trembled as he approached the building. He hadn't stepped inside a workplace in years. As he entered, people gave him wary glances. But Morgan Freeman's name carried weight. It was an unspoken guarantee. At first, he was hired as a warehouse worker, quiet, reserved, keeping to himself. He spoke to no one, and no one trusted him. But over time, things changed. He learned to rebuild trust. The people around him noticed his dedication and relentless work ethic. And then, one day, his manager turned to him and said, "I want to offer you a full-time position." The man couldn't believe his ears. This was the first real step back into life. As the years passed, the man became more than just a worker. He became a mentor. He started helping newly released ex-convicts. He saw himself in their eyes, hopeless, rejected, but desperately wanting to change. But there was still something missing inside him. One day, in a bookstore, a novel caught his attention. As he flipped through its pages, his hands trembled. The story reminded him of his own life. And that's when he realized, "I have a story to tell too." He enrolled in literature classes. He began to write. But with every word, he relived his past. The ink that flowed onto the pages seemed to cleanse the regrets buried deep inside him. He didn't sugarcoat anything. He wrote about the pain, the mistakes, the fall, and the long road to redemption. And finally, he chose the title for his book, "The Man Who Pulled Me from the Pit." For this man, Morgan Freeman was the one who had pulled him up when no one else would, the one who had shown him the light. On the last page of the book, he wrote, "To the man who saved me from darkness." He never called himself a savior, but sometimes all it takes to save someone is to hold their hand and pull them back up. Years later, at a charity event, Morgan Freeman had just finished his speech when a man stepped up to the podium. His hands trembled slightly, but his eyes burned with determination. "Hello, Morgan. Do you remember me?" Morgan turned to him and smiled. "Of course I do." The man extended a book toward him. "This is for you, because you didn't just give me a job. You reminded me that I was still human." Morgan took the book, glancing at the cover for a few seconds. Then he lifted his gaze to meet the man's eyes and gave him a slow, respectful nod. The audience rose to their feet, their applause echoing through the hall. But for Morgan Freeman, the greatest reward was the light he now saw in the man's eyes. Because true heroism isn't about saving someone. It's about giving them the strength to save themselves. As the applause continued, Morgan opened the book and read the dedication on the first page. The words summed up everything. "To the man who pulled me from the darkness, thank you for reminding me I was still human." Morgan looked up, locking eyes with the man. A warm smile spread across his face. "You did this yourself," he said softly. "I only showed you the way." And in that moment, for the first time in his life, the man felt truly free, because he was no longer a ghost of his past. He was a man reborn.